Oh, I just get so bored with these petty struggles like, are you a Marxist feminist? Are you a lesbian feminist? Are you a this? Are you that? Are you a vegetarian? Do you shave your legs? I mean, it's just repeating the whole male cycle, which is that you polarize. And as far as I'm concerned, polarization is the bacillus of Western thought. There's no need for it. If feminism means anything, it's diversity. It's true, we have to have a common cause, and we have to have a highly structured organization to fight the government and the multinational corporations. But aside from that, I think there's a lot of room, and that we don't have to take up these positions and then defend them as though our whole egos were on the line, which is exactly what men do.
When the civil rights movement became the black nationalist movement, the misogyny that black men share very deeply with white became more and more intense. Black nationalist men took this and started researching African history and began to say, well, in Africa, it is always the men who rule and the women bear children and they plant their little vegetable gardens. You must retreat from the controlling role you have had and, for example, symbolically walk 3 paces behind your man. During political meetings, we will sit and busy ourselves with embroidery or some such things. We will not talk when the men talk. The energy that should have gone towards fighting the system turned itself on to fighting black women, and the failure to deal with us as human beings, the insistence that to gain our manhood as black men, we will spit upon black women, because that'll give us the strength we need to fight white men, you see. That is where all of the energy went, and that is one very important reason that the black movement has in large part fallen apart.
I'm meant to propose that sex is a political category the way class is or race, and that one sex has dominated the life of the other sex all through recorded history, the whole patriarchal period, which is under the system, and a patriarchy is a kind of government. Under that, you know, all power of all institutions is in male hands, and females are second-class citizens and psychologically oppressed and kept out of all office of importance and significance in a culture and so on. And the world as we know it, it's a man's world.
Many feminists who knew Ti-Grace's deep commitment to women and feminism were shocked when she did not go along with the current thrust of thought about what makes up the real feminist, the pure feminist. She united herself to the Attica struggle, and Debbie just quoted to you from her comment on that, when other feminists were suggesting that, and here again I more or less quote, after all, the men of Attica was sexist, so why mourn them anymore? She had never worked with the left, so how come, the question went around, how come she wasn't supporting women who had, as they put it, turned to feminism and left the revolutionary movement? For me, there is an enormous paradox just in that. Feminism, for me, is the revolutionary movement.
I think that all of these committed resistance people, that those of us who are above ground must speak out and must do everything we can to try to make people see that there are interconnections and that we need each other and that we must help each other for several reasons. The most obvious is that people are terrified by the grand juries and the FBI, and so what help these people may have been receiving may well have been strongly diluted. So that by people speaking out in their support, people will be encouraged again, if maybe they have suspicions sometime about somebody, to not ask any questions and just help. That's one thing. In the long run, to also think more radically, too, in terms of change. And also to fill out our own theories. I think alliances are very, very, very hard, but I think they must be done.
I don't think I don't think it would be possible this time to send the women back home again. The first wave, they won the legal rights on paper. It had not really changed the expectations and the behavior and the possibilities of life for the great majority of women. But this time it has. I mean, the expectations of my daughter and her generation, and of my own generation, and the generation in between, it's all different. And the possibilities of life are different. And you can't turn it off. You can't either send the women home again from the jobs they hold outside the home, or the economy would collapse. And you can't send the women back again from the definition of themselves as people.
Yes, I am a feminist.
Why?
Why? Because I had the proverbial click.
What does that mean?
The click, that's the moment of truth. That's all. And if you've had it, you know what it is.
I want my daughter to have complete freedom of choice of any career that she wants, whether it's a typical field that men have been in or not. In fact, she just got a big truck for her birthday present. And my mother said, well, you're trying to make her into a truck driver. And I said, no, I just always was never allowed to play with trucks, and I want her to play with them if she likes it. And she happens to love it.
You know, so I'm married, and certain things I vow to my husband because it means more to his ego than it does to mine. That's all.
I don't like to use a label, but I am strongly in favor of changes for women.
I definitely feel like what my idea of feminism is like the roles, the typical female roles I feel in themselves are oppressive.
Oppressed?
Mm-hmm.
No.
No. Why? I just would rather be treated the way I've always been treated. That kind of thing.
That's my feminism right here. Waving the camera, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you're a feminist.
Right.
Yes. Why?
Because I'm a female, that's mine.
What made you a feminist?
Well, one could say art. The desire for beauty. The distinction between my observation of life, which I quickly perceived was not what it should be for people, what it could be for people. And I used for this an aesthetic standard. So I think that art influenced my background as an artist, as a critic, and as an aesthetician. Made me into a revolutionary.
I think I was always a feminist. There wasn't any place to put it for a long time. So then when it came along, I jumped right on. I thought it was splendid because I'd been thinking this in my mind all my life. And finally, other people were saying this, and you weren't just crazy anymore. You weren't just some peculiar person with a hobby horse or a grudge against the world, or someone who needed analysis or something like that.
Well, there are a lot of different levels to answer that on, but I think that it would start. The first place that I would start to discuss that would be my childhood. I think that most women who have become radical feminists and conscious of the female condition started out, well, I speak personally about myself, as a child, for example. I certainly wasn't a feminist as a child, but all of the seeds for what is now my radical feminism certainly was sown in my childhood.
There's really no other way you can go if you're a woman and you want to live an independent life. And I think as a child, I knew that that's what I wanted, so it just was natural, like growing up. And I grew up around strong women.
And I guess the frustrations and also the tools, the mechanisms for figuring out what had happened, my psychological training, my economics orientation from my newspaper reporter days. And then if I want to go back further, I could say my mother, my mother had been a newspaper woman, and then she never was completely using her energy as a wife, mother in a small American city, doing good work in the community, and I was very sharply aware of her frustration and of her inability to really be happy as a woman, and so all these things just came together in my life, and then I could put them into words.
I was worn out, I was exhausted, I had seemed to have lost energy and interest in something called the black movement, in politics that means. And I began to read feminist theory, and I said, oh, it is possible for me to use every part of myself and still be political. I don't have to say, well, that part of me is female and that's not important, we don't have to talk about that. This part as the exclusively black part is fine, or this part as the leftist part, you know, and not the black part is fine if I'm at a white leftist meeting. All of a sudden it was possible for me not to have to deny huge portions of myself to be politically active. And when I say me, you know, I speak for, I suspect, most black women who encountered feminism.
And I was at Columbia during the uprisings there, working on my PhD in philosophy. I was involved in feminism, but I would not say I was a feminist in the way I am now. That is, committed in a life sense to it. When the struggle became very meaningful and people's lives were changed permanently because of certain choices, and everyone had to make a choice, that then, as you chose a position, you discovered people, and you became very close to those people, especially if you took a more radical position. And I think that that's really when I became a feminist.
And then it just, you know, it took up and swept, and it really changed my life as an artist as well. And I couldn't have, say, written, I don't think, if I hadn't had the kind of energy, the support of other women, especially around sexual politics. I mean, thinking and saying the same kind of stuff. So that this sort of argument, which had been going on in my mind since I was a kid even, suddenly there were, oh, it just sort of, you know, came together into a sort of a ball, and it, you know, rolled and went and so on. And I don't think I would have faced down Columbia University and turned it into a thesis either if it hadn't been for my friends. People like Ti-Grace, for example, that I used to go to meetings with when there were only 15 people in the whole movement in New York. Stuff like that. And Lila. And all of what I said in sexual politics is what we used to say to each other all the time.
Most feminists in the United States became feminists through Betty Friedan's work, A Feminine Mystique. Certain feminists were most influenced by de Beauvoir's work. I certainly have always felt I came out of de Beauvoir's work. I felt that she went after the basic institutions of the society and questioned them. It was just a much more fundamental kind of approach.
The first French woman writer that made a big impact on me, of course, was Simone de Beauvoir, with The Second Sex, which I read when I was a student at Oxford. And it confirmed everything, and so forth. And I was profoundly impressed by that book. And I think that was the sort of undercurrent of my whole time at Oxford, in fact, was absorbing that book. At another level, I had to learn from my examinations, but more than anything else I read the whole time I was at Oxford, and it was not required reading, of course. I was reading a course in English literature. that confirmed all my perceptions about the world.
It seems funny now because so much history has happened since then. But I remember long meetings at the Feminists just trying to get a title for the group, deciding on the Feminists with a subtitle of something to do with a group dedicated to the annihilation of sex role stereotyping. We couldn't get it much more out than that, so that interested me, and also the thinking of Anne and Ti-Grace interested me enormously. So I became deeply, deeply engaged and committed to that group.
Then I came home and I taught in America, and I became a sculptor, and then I went to Japan for 2 years. And when I came home, I really had a lot of naive ideas, thinking, well, Japan's a really heavy place to be a woman, and the oppression of women is so gross and obvious and so on. But back home in America, it was awful, because I got home in America and I couldn't even get a job for 80 days with this fancy education of mine and all the rest. And I was just at this appropriate moment that I hit on Betty Friedan's book, which explained, in the way that Simone de Beauvoir's book explained the world, and Friedan's book explained the United States and the first feminist wave, and then the hiatus, the counter-revolution, the death of that feminism, and it's sort of, you know, called for another one to come and so forth.
Mrs. Friedan, women have invaded just about every field, professional, business, and just about everything else you can mention. Why do you feel that an organization such as yours is necessary at this time?
You know, that's an illusion. There are a few women in every field today, but the great majority of American women are not participating in terms of their full potential of ability in the mainstream of American society. The majority of American women in many age groups are working outside the home, but most of them are working at low-paid, relatively low-skilled jobs, often in a dead end from professional advancement, and they are not really taking part in the decision-making areas of American life in anything except token numbers. And the time has long since come for us to confront the conditions that prevent women from really taking a fully equal place in American society. If you could think 10 years ago how few we were, you know, how few we were, what nerve it took, you know, to what I think, and I wrote here, to what we did in the name of American women or women of the world when there were just a few of us, and we would demand that the law be changed, that the president issue an executive order, which he did, saying that if a company or an institution that had a government contract didn't take steps to end discrimination against women, as well as blacks, that they could lose the government contract. And we'd charge in and we'd say to the President of the United States, you must do this. And we knew somehow that there were all the women behind us. And it happened. And so much has changed so fast in the expectations and the behavior of women and the way women are treated and the possibilities for women. None of us could have dreamed it. The Republicans have any intelligence, and I think they'll have this much intelligence, they will compete with the Democratic Convention in giving women a full voice, in having in their platform a strong plank committed to the interests of women. If they were really smart, they would replace Spiro Agnew with a woman vice president. But they will certainly, I think, and I know that the Republican women in the caucus and Republican women generally are going to fight for these things.
When you are a member of a group, certain angers come forth. I think what early feminism did, and I was part of that process, was the anger, the repressed anger that women had had for so long about their lives began to come to the surface. And although we were a group very dedicated to trying to construct theory, write papers, etc., in talking, we weren't a consciousness-raising group, but even in the dialoguing about theory, our angers came to the fore, and one's vision begins to change.
I think that it's simply the question that as long as employers have the collaboration of a paper like the New York Times, which carries the most of the advertising for employment, that they will continue to be able to pay half pay to women, and they would be able to that way make a much higher profit at the expense of over half the population. And this is what just can't be tolerated anymore. I mean, it's ridiculous.
I believe very strongly that one should live one's beliefs. And at that time, tactically, I believed that men were the enemy. I did not believe that biologically they were necessarily and incurably the enemy. I didn't believe, in other words, in some racial superiority theory. But I did believe that women were not going to be able to overthrow their own oppression without banding together as a group and putting their anger together, and their anger would propel them forward into a unity against men.
We're all the time having to fight the exterior world and all that, which is a very real set of conditions in which all power is in male hands and so on and so forth. But so much of the problem is in us too, and really in us, in our own, in all the damage that's been done to us, you know, up to this point, up to this very day. Younger women probably will have less of that to hassle. Older women have more of it. But it's how many days and moments you've been immersed in a really unfriendly, unfamiliar, destructive set of psychic forces, of attitudes about yourself. And if it were just a matter of changing discrimination or something, we could write up a whole series of laws and paste them all over and that'd be it. But with women, just as with any oppressed group, the thing gets interiorized and it rots our souls too. So that we really have a cause to say, look, we really not only have been, discriminated against and treated unfairly and so on, but, seriously aggrieved and destroyed in a sense. And we have to fight back for all the inches of our souls that have been eroded by this, and that's very hard.
I think one of the strongest aspects of female socialization is centered on the whole mythology, the male mythology of childbirth for women. And when I say the male mythology of that, I mean making it not only the most glorious experience that women can ever anticipate to have in their life, but the only experience that thus far the male society has given any real credence to. And I think that is one of the myths that has kept women as oppressed as they are, their internalization of that particular mythology, finding their safety in their life, not in evolving their freedom, but in passing over their lives into the life of another.
The whole confidence to be, so much of that was just kicked out of us by the time we were 5 or 6 years old. So that whatever we achieve is twice as hard, and in a sense is earned with greater difficulty and honor even. But what a waste. Why should it be so hard, Why should we be having to just fight for the lost ground in our own souls and hearts and our own sense of ourselves and so on? And that's the thing I think I resent the most, is that the way the sense of self is eroded in us. All that standing around and trembling and wondering if you can do it business. And I spent a lot of my life doing that.
There are horror stories of women who had been brainwashed into believing we were supposed to answer every black man who approached us on the street, because of course it was all about sisterhood and brotherhood and love. And some man would say, "Hey sister, how you doing?" And you would say, "Hello brother," and you get slapped. In some occasions you might get raped. The next thing you knew, this man was following you down the street saying, "Oh, let's go to bed," and you'd say no, and he'd be screaming, "You dirty black bitch," at you. What's the matter with you? Every trick, every exploitative warrior trick men have ever used was rolled out on us in the name of the black movement.
All of the sexism, the dominant submission patterns that that are so deeply, deeply rooted in our every gesture, by our I mean men and women, in our every act, the way we eat, the way we talk, everything. I began to become, it was like watching a movie. You know, I would be sitting and watching this show, and whereas I normally could have just gone on, I found that, to put it simply, it was boring. I was bored with the old patterns, bored with the old games. So that existentially what I found was that without saying to myself, I think I'll have no more male friends, because I certainly did not make such a decision, more and more my life, my engaged everyday living had to do with women, and with women who more and more the historical moment was growing into a feminist moment.
It's a cliche, of course, now. In most places, when you first get together with women, you always thought you were the only woman in the world who always met nothing but jerks, right? People would say, oh, you have a way of always finding the guy who's the jerk in the crowd, right? And you're alone, so you never tell anybody about it because obviously you have terrible taste. And then you meet all these other women who also met all the jerks in the world. And you put all those jerks together and you realize that men are a problem. So, taking that position, I didn't see how you could say men are the enemy and walk around with them. It was really quite simple.
My encounters with men, you know, the simplest encounter with a man, whether a man you work with or someone you have dinner with, the simplest encounter can turn into a conflict. So one is always watchful there. I'm always assessing women I meet in terms of, you know, how do we feel about them? How are we relating to such and such situation? For better or worse, there is not a situation in one's daily life that does not have feminist subtext, superstructure, implications, and one is constantly aware of them. Even when you want to rest, it stands up and hits you in the face.
But as far as not speaking to a man and not walking down the street with a man, the reason that attracted so much attention at the time was not that what I was doing was so peculiar, but what everybody else was doing was so peculiar. That is, they were saying men are the enemy, and they were associating with them constantly. So it became, isn't that strange? She doesn't speak or associate with men. Wow. But there was really nothing at all strange about that position, because that was the rhetorical position taken by radical feminists at the time. It was just there was a gap between the rhetoric and the actuality.
Then a little bit after that, a very important thing happened, and that is, and I came out in favor of gay liberation and caused a great stir and so forth. All of which was a tremendous personal trauma for me as well. Not only my own ambiguous position in supporting both gay liberation and the women's movement, and certain people in the women's movement saying this is not politic, this is not expedient, hush hush, we need respectability, and so on, and my knowing that morally that's the worst kind of compromise and expediency, and so dishonest. Also, as someone gay, I couldn't deny gay liberation, and as any thinking person, the whole connection between women's liberation and gay liberation is so obvious, and here two groups so oppressed for so many of the same reasons.
In the movement, I brought the issue up in '68, and you could hear the ovaries roll on the floor. So great was the shock in the meeting. And I was bounced out of the National Organization for Women, and then later a lot of trouble in Red Stockings, which at that time was a radical group, because people still had trouble with this issue. So myself and Martha Shelley and some other women formed Radical Lesbians because the heterosexual women didn't want to work with us at that time.
But, well, it's all very easy to make these, you know, political pronouncements, you know. I had a lot of trouble with my family. I had a lot of uncertainty in myself. I had the whole business of coming to terms with being gay was very hard for me. It was a real sort of terribly up and down and a very difficult time, but it entirely changed my life. It also finally made me a much freer person to write what I wanted to, not to be dictated to by anybody. And so it made it possible for me to become a writer, not just an author, but a writer in the sense of a serious, writing, as an artist. And that was a tremendous, that was like such a gift to be able to go ahead and do that.
Well, you asked me when did I first come out, when did I tell anyone I was a lesbian. I was 15, which was 1961, hardly a progressive period in American history. And I was so innocent, I was in love. I didn't think there was anything wrong with being in love, so it was a woman instead of a man. And so I told people and very quickly found out that this was a fate worse than death, which I didn't believe, but I got in a lot of trouble.
If you were black, you'd really find it hard having close friendships with white races. There are degrees and degrees of races, even given that everybody's got some. Sexism's like that too. I've had a long and very beautiful relationship with a man, Fumio Yoshimura, the sculptor, and for a long 10 years or so. But I also feel, as many women feel now, very much closer to other women than they do to men, which is sort of part of a whole, we're going towards, I think, a society where it will be possible for people to love as a matter of indifference even, a man or a woman, as it would be easily ethnic group or religious group or economic group or nationality or all the other little insuperable barriers we managed to get across finally.
I think one thing that's interesting as far as the role that lesbianism has played as an issue in terms of feminism is how many issues, such as, for example, what's called separatism, has appeared or has come together. For example, the notion of separatism and separating off from men in order to define ourselves in my own head came about through radical feminism, which for me was almost synonymous with political lesbianism, or the notion of the autonomous woman, which had really nothing to do with sexuality in the terms of a genital sex. It had to do with women finding themselves so that they could then bond together as a strong force to change things.
Unfortunately, then a counter-cycle set in, and a lot of lesbians said, we're the true revolutionaries and you aren't. I mean, it's natural. Somebody punches you, you counter-punch. It may be natural, but it's not necessarily evolved, and it creates bad feelings. And so this was a very, emotionally painful issue in the movement for 3 years. Now, it started to settle down a little in 1973, partly because of a function of age. We were all very young. We were in our early 20s when this started happening. We began to grow up, literally, get a little more mature, have distance from these issues, and I think the movement began to see that women can't afford to maintain distinctions men have created. Lesbianism is a distinction that men made, not us. And if we maintain those distinctions, be it lesbianism or race or class background, we are going to create a warped version of the very society we seek to change. So we've got to make common cause, and if anything, we have to embrace difference, not run away from it.
So I think lesbianism means a great many different things to many different people. To me, its point has always been what I call political lesbianism, which meant a kind of super commitment to women. And the idea was that women who were lesbian, because they had to turn to other women for their emotional and physical needs to be met, that this would necessarily make them fight for the position of women more, whether it was economically or whatever other rights were involved.
We found that although people generally understood the discrimination that occurred in the other areas, that they really weren't alert to what was happening in discrimination based upon sex. It was something that was kind of kidded about, it was a kind of a joke, but it really isn't a joke now for the women who are trying to get a good job or a good education. They can't get a good job without a good education, and there are barriers, ones which we tend to ignore. Now, why? Because we're just behind the times.
Very early on, I knew that this world is not what they told us it was. I mean, because we were poor when other people rode by in a Cadillac, and yet in school they're telling you about equality. You know there was no equality. That person had money and you didn't have any. So you started to ask a lot of questions very early. I think women from privileged backgrounds, it took them longer because there was so much protecting padding, you know, real padding between them and the tough world. But slowly it drifted away, especially by the time they got out of college and found out they had a wonderful education and were fit to be a secretary. And then they became radicalized, I think, in their 20s.
So my childhood was one in which, you know, I watched a situation in my household in which it became very clear to me, although it made for many splits in me, it became very clear that the person in the household who was getting the goodies was my father. And I tend to think that most women who become feminists start by being what I call male-identified, which of course is the antithesis of what feminism is, but I'm talking about in childhood. What happened was I saw my father, I saw that he had a freedom. He came in and out of the house at his will. When my mother needed something, I saw, if we make a silent movie out of it, for example, I would see my mother standing and literally practically begging my father, and then my father's hand going into his pocket and giving her money. Okay, so we're talking about the fact that she was dependent on him economically. And I saw an enormous amount of freedom on the part of my father, and an enormous amount of being stuck, to put it, you know, simply, in the house on the part of my mother.
Since any time we can remember, not fantasize or read about or mythologize about, but any time we can remember or have been told about, we have survived through a man. When we break away from that and try to stand on our own, we've gotten jobs, so on. The feminist movement started in a time when there were more openings. In this country, certainly very much affected by the war. Now that's been affected, and what are women to do? Where are they to go? Especially the ones who have broken away. We don't have solutions. I sense a tremendous fear. I hear women talking about marriage who weren't talking about it before, I mean, who wouldn't have considered it before. I think we've suffered from not having an adequate or really even taking seriously that you were going to have to account for money or economics.
I think the way people treat you, particularly male society, radicalizes a woman much more quickly. If she's still, let's say she's the doctor's wife, she still, again, has that protective padding. But if you're a lesbian, you're out there trying to make your own living. You can't lean on anyone else economically. So you begin to look at the society in economic terms much more harshly, because you can't get the good jobs because you're a woman. And even if you did get a good job, you might get fired if they found out you're a lesbian. So it does tend to wake somebody up quickly.
All right, there is a very good sentence written by a black woman named Kay Lindsay in which she said, "Where the white woman is the sexual object, black women are sexual laborers." Yes. White womanhood has been the prevailing standard of femininity in this country. If you were beautiful, you had pale skin, and women have only gained by being beautiful. You had light skin, preferably light hair. You were gentle, you were retiring, you were sweet, you were chaste. Because of our historical position as black women, most of us were slaves, which means we worked as hard as any men on plantations. Then we moved into factories. Most of us were not pure because on plantations we were bought to be breeders and whores. We were not qualified for the prevailing standards of femininity, white femininity, so we were cast out. If you are a woman who does not fit women's standards, you're a piece of crap. So we got none of the benefits of being a woman. They're double-edged benefits, but they are benefits. Money from wealthy men, so on and so forth. We got all of the liabilities. As I said before, we are on the lowest rung, even in a profession like prostitution, because we are valueless as black women. So we were brought up outside the pale of femininity, but we weren't considered worth turning into useful men. You know, because what is a black woman? She's a woman and she is also black. We weren't as good as black men, and we were useless. We weren't good enough to be imitated white women, so we had nothing. We were total outsiders, which is why, you know, economically we are on the absolute bottom, and psychologically, if you will, of the barrel.
Feminism must have some sort of economic comprehension of the exchange of goods and how that operates in a society, how it fluctuates. So that in this country we have been hit by a recession. We've been in a recession for a couple of years. We have inflation. We have women being laid off very heavily. There has been a big cutback on many programs that would have helped people before. I think the black movement, it's hard to say whether the poverty programs went first, black movement, I mean the two things sort of went out together. But what are women to do? Women who have broken away, who have tried to become autonomous. You have to eat. You have to live.
As I say, figuring out a theory that will embrace the paradox of fighting sexism, fighting the sexism of a group of people who are fighting racial and economic oppression from another group. It's a very interesting pyramid. It is black women being oppressed by white women who are also black women being oppressed by white women, black men, and white men. That is a situation that only non-white, if you will, black, Latin, so forth, Chinese women find themselves in. It is the kind of complexity that the white feminist movement has not yet in any way attempted to deal with.
What is it you're trying to do?
Well, we are really trying to do something about, for instance, the conditions that prevent women from easily combining marriage and motherhood and work in the professions. We're trying to do something about the spoken and unspoken barriers of discrimination on the basis of sex, discrimination against women that still exists in certainly all the executive and higher ranks of most professions and of most businesses and industry. And we are also trying to do something about the areas of inequality that burden men as well as women, as long as the relationship between the sexes is one of what we would now call half equality.
What Betty had called the problem with no name became a movement without an idea, without an ideology. And this has been one of our problems, and this is why I think that we have gone through a fallow period. I think that there is the beginnings of a resurgence. People have been very tired, what we call burnt out, but many people are getting up again and trying to learn from mistakes, namely not having a clear idea of what we were doing and wanting to put that together.
Well, this is also a question that I've been giving a lot of thought to. And in the end of my book, Change Your Life, Change My Life, I say, you know, I write an open letter to the women's movement for 1976 because they had been sort of tolling the bell and saying the women's movement in the U.S. is in crisis, or it's peaked, or it's fading, and then they make the specter of, after the vote was won in 1920, then the women whole century struggle that led to the winning of the vote just dissipated. And will this happen to the second wave? And I have to say this. We have suffered some setbacks in the U.S. Some setbacks in this business of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And then the women's movement has become so large that its very success has mounted a reactionary wave against it. The reactionary forces of the church, of the Catholic Church, and of the reactionary profiteer that have exploited women, especially companies like the insurance companies, and even reactionary political forces which have manipulated women in their timidities, in their fears, in their passivity. Women were the largest group of people that could be easily manipulated. And they have even, we learned from the hearings that happened after Watergate, they've even sent agents into the women's movement to infiltrate it. These reactionary forces see suddenly the threat to themselves in women acquiring their own independence and in not being so easily manipulated. The opposition has focused on the right to abortion and on the Equal Rights Amendment.
The movement is 10 years old. It seemed to be having a profound potential in 70, 71. It seemed on the brink of exploding in many directions.
It should be.
Freedom, freedom, nothing.
For the time being, we have lost a lot of that potential. I think we may well lose our gains in abortion. Since 71, the income gap has increased between male and female. So we've lost ground there. All of these things, I think, have to be looked at so that as we find our bearings again, that we can change it.
And I think politically, the goal is clear, which is that we must take over state power. But I also think we have to recognize this may not come in our lifetime. I want it to. I desperately want to see that day. But if I'm a serious political person, I know that I must keep working toward it, and I may not see it, but that I have to trust that my labor is just a bridge, and then other people can keep building it when I'm dead and gone.
We're on a sort of a great project now, women discovering ourselves, expressing ourselves. It's a tremendously euphoric time to be a woman, or a woman writer, or a woman artist, or around the women's movement, or whether you have nothing to do with it. Still, there's this is a whole class of people, oppressed for just millennium, suddenly, like breathing air and drinking in the light. That we find in each other a very special rapport now. I think it's very natural, too. For me now, women are the interesting people. I like men, but women fascinate me now, and the elan, this sort of kind of discovery that we're engaged in now is the most interesting thing there could be now.
And I think something else, that the experience of the women's movement, what we've done, has changed us. And that by now has affected enormous numbers of women, whether they were ever in an organization or not. They say we about the women's movement. And it's experience. We've experienced something, and that's given a new dimension to our humanity. And that you can't take away, and that's the reward right now, whether, in addition to all the things that are changed. And I said in my book, I said that someday we'll look back and we will see that the movement itself, that this life-opening, passionate journey, toward women's equality, was the most intense life that any of us, could have hoped to experience, this making of our history. And that men that never had these problems and women that were too ladylike to get involved will envy us, because we lived the Second American Revolution.
it's not as simple as it used to be when we were trying to integrate the want ads in the New York Times, you know. And the whole business of a struggle for human freedom becomes bigger and more definite. I mean, easier to understand, but harder to change.
There are people like myself in other movements who are in very serious trouble, and they must be supported. Not for their sake, but for my sake, and for the sake of feminism.
It got to be, you know, like a sort of a bigger and bigger and bigger set of concerns. And by the time you're concerned with political prisoners, you've acquired a much more international viewpoint. You're more interested not in nations and their silly nationalisms and all that, but questions of, say, civil rights and human rights all over the world, regardless of who's running their government or who's stomping on human beings in this place or another. And things like torture and the heinousness and hideousness of torture.
It cannot be feminist to collaborate with the government against the underground. The government is the enemy and that you cannot cooperate with it. So I've been working very much with defense committees, with the Pat Swenton Defense Committee,
who's on the Student Sex Defense Committee. It was so great to hear somebody use that term. So what I'm asking for tonight, because we owe it to each other and to ourselves, not to leave Pat Swenton alone and other women who are alone facing the state, or Susan Sachs alone. So the last paragraph of her letter is this: I haven't done any extensive writing for over 3 weeks, and this letter is obviously the breaking point. Jail really has a way of sapping the will. I have to fight it all the time. Right now it's so fucking cold in here that it hurts my fingers to hit the keys. People sleep almost all day to get away from the cold. I find myself wanting to sleep all day to get away from everything. There's so much I have to block just to stay reasonably calm. Sometimes I just blot out whole periods of time. I'm constantly having to drag myself back to the reality of who I am and what I stand for. It's a struggle just to hang on to the belief that I'm not alone. Not ultimately, but just day to day. It's just a struggle not to blow up at each and every indignity, all the little things you'd fight back at it in the street or simply avoid having to confront. But getting letters like yours is getting a shot of adrenaline. Look, I could do it alone if I had to, because I know I'm right, but I don't have to go it that way. And letters like yours are my lifeline. Sister, someone in the belly of the beast is glad you're back from the grave. You can't ever go back, not now. We need each other too much. I take it very personally. As far as I'm concerned, you owe it to me to keep fighting, and I owe it to you, and we owe it to ourselves. It's scary when we start to feel the ground slipping out from under us, when we start to feel alone. But that's how we defeat ourselves. We have to break that attitude of defeat. Here. Now. Like this. I promise you, Ti-Grace, that as long as you are fighting, you will never be alone, because I will be there. I swear it. In sisterhood, Susan.
I have never known Ti-Grace to follow an ism. I have always known her to think through issues and make her own unpredictable stand on them. Another word here for unpredictable could be courageous. The courage to not fall into the traps of past isms and blindly repeat any line or theory. To not petrify into a given mouthpiece for what any group line is at any given moment, but to think issues through carefully, for oneself. Often in our desperate need for approval from the crowd and or our friends, we stop thinking and we begin to regurgitate that which we sensed we should feel or we should say, so as to remain approved of. Think before you mouth back reactions that have not been formulated by you, but by the left, the right, the center, or feminists.